Hi, I'm Dr. Mark Pope, and in this presentation I'm going to talk about ethnography and ethnographic approaches to research, specifically observation. Using ethnographic approaches and observations in your research can be useful in revealing how and why people act in the ways that they do. It's been used extensively to understand more about a range of peoples, from indigenous cultures to online communities to football hooligans, and its focus on people makes it potentially valuable for this project. In this presentation we'll talk about the definition and aims of ethnography and observation. We'll think about the data it can gather and the information it can yield. We'll think about the kind of research question that it can help you answer. And then we'll move on to talk about the types of observations that can be undertaken, followed by the potential difficulties that can arise. We'll also look at the benefits of using mixed methods, and then we'll present a step-by-step guide to setting up observations before we conclude. What is ethnography? An ethnography is a study of a person, people or culture. It is, by definition, written down. Ethno comes from the Greek word ethnos and stands for people, culture or nation, and graphy implies writing. Therefore, an ethnography is a piece of writing about people. Ethnography attempts to understand how people operate. It tries to gauge what it's like to walk in another person's shoes and gain an insight into an aspect of their life. A very common tool employed in ethnographic research is observation, and we will be looking at different approaches to observation that can be adopted below. Ethnography involves studying people in the field in a natural real-world setting. The term was first used to describe deep anthropological study of distant communities by academics during the colonial era. And, over time, ethnographic research came to signify an investigation of a particular culture in depth. However, it is now recognised that the study does not have to be on the entirety of a culture or group, and the focus could be on one aspect in one type of situation. So, for your research, you might look at how technology impacts on the lives of one aspect of one particular demographic within society. What data does ethnography gather, and what information does it yield? Ethnography gathers data that focuses on what people do, not what they say they do. It is about generating a deep understanding of how people act in their social environment. Instead of focusing simply on facts, it focuses on the processes that guide what people do and investigates how things happen and how social groups work. If the researcher is to gain an insight into how people function in a particular situation, the data that is collected will require interpretation. Accordingly, ethnography requires information that goes beyond shallow descriptions. Therefore, ethnography attempts to create thick descriptions that capture the social meaning and context. It considers how phenomena will be interpreted by those involved and the consequences of these interpretations. To give a basic example, what does it actually mean if a subject has one of their eyes closed? Is it a humorous wink, or does the subject just have something in their eye? A little bit of context observed by the researcher can go a long way in explaining the meaning and possible implications. What kind of research question can it help answer? Ethnographies are commonly used to answer research questions focused on an individual case study. They are useful when trying to understand how people act in specific situations, especially where face-to-face interviews might not yield trustworthy or relevant information. Some subcultures, groups or topics are particularly difficult to understand for those not involved within them. In 1968, due to perceived misunderstandings, Erving Goffman investigated and observed life within mental health hospitals. He argued that many of the apparently irrational acts of the patients were not irrational when seen in the context of the hospital. Through observations and ethnography, Goffman was able to argue strongly that some of the forms of discipline, dress and behaviour imposed on the patients made it almost impossible for people to behave like those in the outside world. So what types of method are associated with ethnography? Well, here we are focusing on observations. They are a key method associated with ethnography, and there are different ways of approaching them. When conducting observations, the researcher may try to stand either outside of or within the culture that he or she is investigating. In effect, the researcher chooses whether to become a participant in the activities that the group are undertaking. Alternatively, some researchers adopt a covert position and do not disclose that they are researching their subjects. However, this has serious ethical implications about deception and makes it impossible to obtain informed consent from the subjects. Covert approaches to observation are therefore rarely approved or adopted now, and therefore most researchers adopt an overt role and disclose details of their research to the subjects who are being researched. As the researcher can adopt a covert or overt role as an active participant or a passive observer, in 1958 Raymond Gold suggested a fourfold typology for approaches to observation. These had varying levels of involvement with the subjects. Firstly, there is the complete participant, where the observer conceals that he or she is a researcher. They act as naturally as possible within the group and try to become a full member of the group. Secondly, there is the participant as observer, where the group know that the observer is a researcher and the researcher participates within the group. Thirdly, there is the observer as participant, where the researcher is primarily an observer and a participant second. They take little or no part in activities and the role as researcher is known to the group. Finally, there is the complete observer, where the researchers do not disclose their role as observers and do not take part in the activity. Which approach you take requires thoughtful consideration. It will depend on what is practical and ethically possible and what is most appropriate for your research question. So when is it most appropriate and useful to use this method? Well, observations, especially where the researcher is participating in the observed activity, can provide good understanding and empathy of how and why people act in the way they do. As the researcher gathers data from observing the real experience, they can gain a deeper insight in what it is like for the people in that situation. Furthermore, ethnography and observation are particularly useful where other methods might be unable to provide valid answers. For instance, some interviews or questionnaires may fail to yield valid information if interviewees are unable or even unwilling to explain why or how certain practices occur. Therefore, sometimes it is only through observation that an explanation is possible. So what can it not do? Well, it's difficult but not impossible to use ethnographies to compare situations or even to test broad theories and generalise about broader social phenomena. It is harder to set up such a comparative research design due to the large amount of differences in the details between each ethnographic investigation. There is also a possibility that when a researcher spends time with his or her research subjects, he or she might adopt their perspective to the extent that he or she loses the capacity to evaluate the situation objectively. This phenomenon is termed going native. Alternatively, there is a possibility that the cultures being studied will be labelled as strange. Therefore, suspending preconceptions and fighting familiarity can be key challenges for an ethnographer. And research has shown that the social background of the researcher impacts on how well they can gain access and trust. There are also a number of ethical issues raised by observing people closely over time. Privacy, anonymity, informed consent, and the consequences of any publication can all become more prescient and require serious consideration. Can it be fruitfully combined with other methods? Yes. Interviews, surveys, conversational analysis, archival analysis, or any other method that provided insight into the people being investigated could well be fruitfully used. Any possibility of corroboration of your data for an additional source or method could be very useful too, and this is known as triangulation. An example of a mixed method approach is provided by Stephen Hopgood in his book The Keepers of the Flame: Understanding Amnesty International, published in 2007. In his research he asked what was it like in an NGO and what factors impacted on operations at Amnesty International. He interviewed 150 members of staff and observed meetings at all levels of the International Secretariat. He also drew material for Amnesty's archives. Through his observations, interviews and archival analysis, Hopgood identified a struggle between the Keepers of the Flame, who seek to preserve Amnesty's accumulated store of moral authority, and reformers, who hope to change, modernise and use that moral authority to compete in the 21st century political environment. Through the use of a number of different methods, Hopgood's claims were well substantiated, and they explained some of the policy dilemmas Amnesty face when wanting to advocate and campaign for an ever-increasing number of human rights abuse victims, whilst maintaining their position as an authoritative truth-teller. So what would be the basic steps to set up an observation? Well, firstly, you need to select a situation to observe. Secondly, secure access to the location and people being observed. Thirdly, decide how you will collect data and on the specific role of the researcher. Fourthly, you need to undertake the observations. And finally, you need to analyse and write up the data. So to conclude, why are ethnographic approaches and observations worth considering for your research? Well, they provide rich data, they investigate subjects in real, authentic settings, they engage with ambiguity and complexity, and they're also less common, so it's easier to provide new insights. So to conclude, why are ethnographic approaches and observations worth considering for your research? Well, they provide rich data, they investigate subjects in real, authentic settings, and they could be applied in a broad range of ways relevant to your research. Importantly, they engage with ambiguity and complexity, and also they're less common, so it's easier to provide new insights.